You don't have to create legitimacy and urgency for Ebola.
Hi, and welcome to the Exposing Obesity Incorporated podcast.
This is episode 2, Novo's Nefarious Plan.
I'm Louise Adams.
And I'm Reagan Chastain.
And we're exposing the sordid underbelly of the weight loss industry, Obesity Incorporated.
Quick note before we start, we know that the word obesity is stigmatizing and harmful, but we're also trying to expose the industry that was created based on the construct of, quote, obesity, which is why we use the word in our podcast name. During the podcast, we do our best to avoid using the term, and when we use it in the podcast, we'll either say, quote, obesity, or Louise's invention, oh, pleasity, with an eye roll always implied. And when we write it, we use an asterisk instead of the E.
But thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so excited to get started on our second episode. And before we get going, if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure that you're subscribed and tell everyone you know about us and what we're doing. We can be found on Instagram, and we're trying to get our followers up into 3 digits. So we're at Exposing Obesity Incorporated. We'd love it if you follow us. And if you have a moment and you're feeling generous, subscribe to the show and tell friends to subscribe, but also leave us a really nice rating and a review, because that bumps us up in the statistics and it really helps get the word out. And for those of you who like to watch, you can see us on YouTube, which is youtube.com/at Exposing Obesity Incorporated. Or you can just listen to us through your ear holes.
Either way. All right, on to the main episode today. On episode 1, we talked about the playbooks that Novo Nordisk is using as it tries to take the profits for Obesity Incorporated through the stratosphere. And today we're going to talk more about how they're doing it. All right, so we're going to start with Novo Nordisk's annual report. And this is a report for its shareholders. In this report in 2015, you can see on pages 28 and 29, there's a section called Obesity Care, Building the Market from Scratch. And this report came out after the CEO had promised the shareholders, as we talked about in episode 1, that they were going to, as their profits from insulin were threatened by price controls, they were going to make a bet on obesity and they were going to create the market. And so now they were sticking it right there in their annual report for everyone to see that this is what they're going to do. And I'm going to read a couple quotes from this, and I'll pause between for Louise's thoughts. But the first quote is, and again, this is from their annual report for their shareholders, quote, "You have to remember that many people, including some doctors and healthcare professionals, simply don't accept that obesity is a disease. Until we can convince them otherwise, we'll struggle to make Saxenda live up to its full potential."
Oh my God. I mean, you said, okay, I'm going to read out a quote, and I'm like, okay, there's going to be some actual scientific breakthrough research here. Silly
oh my
me.
gosh. If you're expecting that, you're going to be waiting a long time because, yeah, science is not what this is about at all.
God, until we can convince them otherwise.
Yes. Yes. A drug company that's trying to take its weight loss drug to its maximum potential by convincing doctors and healthcare professionals of the need for this drug. This does not have the ring of sound science or ethics at all.
It does have the ring of impending profit, however.
Indeed.
Yeah. This is disease awareness in the service of, I have a brand new weight loss drug that I want to make stacks of money from. And the best way, I mean, it is exactly what you're talking about with the Purdue Pharma combo to absolutely medicalize and diseaseify something. Like when they say simply don't accept, that's because of evidence. You know,
Right.
That's because before Novo got its claws into educating almost the entire world about this disease idea, it still is a massive controversy because the weight loss industry have been pushing for decades to have body size, like you said, it's like someone with tallness. They want to brush everyone above a certain BMI as diseased, fully ignoring actual evidence that says lots of people in lots of different body sizes have diseases or not have diseases. And we're not classifying this with any kind of scientific rationale, but it's a very profitable rationale.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that leads me to the second quote here, which is, quote, "Our first aim is to make sure obesity is widely recognized as a chronic disease and that even a moderate weight loss of 5 to 10% could have an impact on weight-related comorbidities." And I want to break this down a little bit. First of all, um, the the boldness here. Right, they're putting this in print. There's like a picture, it's 2 pages. They are very clear. We are going to manipulate the healthcare system to our own ends and in these specific ways. I also want to point out the reason why it's so important that people believe that even a moderate weight loss of 5 to 10% could have an impact on weight-related comorbidities is because that's about the amount of weight loss that Saxenda at that time could produce. And
Boom.
so yeah, I mean, I know, I'm sure you're shocked, Louise, at that.
A complete coincidence that is exactly
Amazing.
because I think it was their clinical trials back then were showing around an 8%.
Yeah.
I mean, when I say clinical trials, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but they had fluffed it into 8%. And so, yeah, smack bang in the middle of
Yeah.
that aim.
Who knew? And this goes back to that weight loss industry playbook. Because here's the thing about this. These two aims to make obesity widely recognized as a chronic disease and to make people believe that moderate weight loss of 5 to 10% could have an impact on what they're calling weight-related comorbidities. This should have been pretty tough to do because neither is true. Right. Obesity is simply a body size. So there are people with the exact same size or BMI with vastly different health statuses. There are people with the same health statuses with vastly different BMIs. And so this idea of weight as a proxy for health has been something that the weight loss industry has been laboring for decades to get us to simply believe without thinking about it. And this next step, the idea that simply existing in a higher weight body is a chronic disease, is sort of the summit of that mountain climb they've been on. And I want to be super clear, there's no shame in having a disease of any kind. The issue is that simply existing in a higher weight body or existing in a higher weight body with health issues doesn't constitute its own disease. By the way this definition often works is that now they're trying to say you don't have obesity unless you also have another health issue, one of these, what they call weight-related comorbidities. And so weight-related comorbidities are health issues that people of all sizes get that get called weight-related when higher weight people have them, which again, not solid science. Like you would get kicked out of any freshman class if you said that this was a good idea or something that made any kind of sense at all. And so basically, if a thin person gets type 2 diabetes, they're a thin person who has type 2 diabetes. But if a fat person gets type 2 diabetes, now they have both type 2 diabetes and the quote unquote disease of quote unquote obesity, which is fully nonsense. So that's scientifically devoid. But then we've got this moderate weight loss thing. And this has been something that has happened through attrition. Originally, there were the metropolitan height weight tables, and they were very specific. If you're this height and this frame, you should be this weight. They couldn't get people to lose anywhere near that amount of weight. So they dropped it to 20%, not based on clinical trials, but because it seemed like a good amount of weight to lose. And it was, and I'm quoting, memorable. People could remember that this was the number. They couldn't get anywhere near 20%, so it dropped to 10, then 5 to 10. I've recently seen 3 to 5, but always attaching this phrase, clinically significant health benefits. And so in 2013, 2 years before this plan was published, Manalstrom and Tomiyama actually did the research to see, do these small amounts of weight loss actually create clinically meaningful health benefits? And they found in correlational analysis, there was no connection between weight loss and the health benefits. And they posited that what was more likely was that behavior changes that people underwent, access to the healthcare system, social support, etc., that those were more likely to be the reason for health changes. But the weight loss industry just acted like that was the report that must never ever be named, and they did not talk about it, and they do not discuss it, and they do not cite it, and they just keep repeating this 5 to 10% weight loss thing until it reaches what I call everybody knows status, which is that there's
Yeah.
no amount of evidence that someone feels they need to claim it, and no amount of evidence could disprove it in their minds. And so that's kind of where we are. And remember, this is in 2015. So that study showing that this 5 to 10% weight loss thing was likely not accurate. That study had been out for a couple years, didn't make the cut in this annual report at all. And they've set themselves these two unscientific goals for what they were clear was the express purpose of making their weight loss drug live up to its full profit potential.
My God, there is so much in what you've just said there. And yes, we will definitely link to that paper in the resources
Yeah.
section. But so what you're saying is that initially weight loss recommendations were like, everyone lose 20%. That couldn't happen. So they halved it to 10%, not
Mhm.
because of any science about
Nope.
actually, no. And then 10% wasn't possible using the various methods available. And so they cut it to 5.
Correct.
Again, not because they're like, oh no, we've done lots of studies and we found that actually we don't need 10% weight loss. We only need 5. That's not how it happened. It only happened because they couldn't achieve the weight loss. So they just dropped, like you said, attrition. And then it became
Exactly.
5% because we hear this all the time. Like it
Yeah.
literally just a 5%, blah, 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 blah. And this is because that's all that's actually going to happen naturally because our physiologically defended mechanisms against weight loss start resisting and we start rebounding. So this is so robust, isn't it? This weight defense and then dropping it to 3%. But my God. So this is
3%. So 3% is like an amount of weight loss I could lose during this podcast with a loofah and a haircut. And this is being called clinically meaningful. It's like the weight loss industry was allowed to lower the hurdle they couldn't clear until it was on the ground and they could just fall over and clear it. And now this is what's passed as science. And
wow.
doctors are saying this. The CDC says it. The WHO says it. It's all over the place. And we'll get into the fact of how many of these organizations are funded by Novo Nordisk as we
Yeah.
go through the podcast. But yeah, this is, to me, the central fraud is this creation of, out of just whole cloth, no science necessary, this idea that 5 to 10% weight loss is what creates health benefits, ignoring the fact that people are making behavior changes prior to these small amounts of temporary weight loss, which when tested separately are shown to create these health benefits, right? So in order to believe this, you have to ignore the fact that people are doing any kind of behavior change and assume that weight loss creates the benefit. But we have studies like Klein et al. That show that with large volume liposuction that removed significant amounts of adipose tissue, there were no health benefits. So the research just does not support this 5 to 10% thing, but it's like the core part. They need it for the con. And so they just have to keep repeating it and stand by it no matter what.
Absolutely. You've got me on my soapbox now. This gets
I
me
know.
really, really fired up. And you know, the other thing that gets really up my nose? This idea that, okay, quote unquote, obesity is this epidemic that's affecting the entire globe, right? And obesity leads to this apparent very big reduction in life expectancy and all kinds of, global warming. Literally everything that's wrong is because too many people are a BMI above 29. And then they say, but if you just shave off 5% of that, you'll be okay. And that means that if everyone managed to do that, we would not move the dial whatsoever on obesity.
Exactly.
And so logically, like, I'm just going to, what the fuck? Like, we need to kind of eradicate or prevent obesity, but also just 5% is all we need to meaningfully improve health. And this is what really gets me stuck in the conviction that I have for weight inclusive care, because the evidence is completely here. We can all see it and we're all talking like it's something completely different. But to see something like this in Novo Nordisk's 2015 shareholder brochure, because
Yeah.
now you read it, now they're onto like the triple GLP-1 agonists and things like that. And they're like basically pushing to get people back to birth weight. And this kind of stuff is vanishing from a lexicon now too, because they're like, oh no, well, if we can like make people 2/3 thinner, then let's do it.
Yeah. It's like a hilarious dance. And when I say hilarious, I mean like LOL sob hilarious. But in the tirzepatide studies, their original approval trial, the lowest dose of tirzepatide showed an average 16% weight loss. Now, we know half the people didn't lose that much weight. There were 3 to 5% who don't lose almost any weight. The weight loss isn't sustained. But by their own measure, they were killing it. But the next trials of tirzepatide dropped that 5 milligram dose completely. And so you'll see them in their studies and the write-ups try to be like, I mean, yeah, 5 to 10% weight loss is clinically meaningful, but like, wouldn't it be better if there was more and more and more, even if that means more and more and more risk? And so it's interesting to watch them do that dance with themselves where they can't contradict themselves. They have to cling to this 5 to 10% number that they've been beating the drums about for 10 years now. But they also want people to take more and more risks, to take more and more expensive drugs. The other thing I think about, and mostly my job is to speak to healthcare providers about these things. And so I was speaking to some healthcare providers who had asked about research that said that 5 to 10% weight loss could improve cancer risk. So my point was, all right, so a 300-pound, 5'3" woman walks in and they say, okay, you need to lose 5 to 10% weight loss to reduce your cancer risk. So let's say she loses 10% at least temporarily. Now she's 270. But if a 270-pound woman walks in, she has to lose 5 to 10% weight loss to reduce her. And it goes all the way down until magically someone goes from a BMI of 30 to a BMI of 29.9, right? Or a BMI of, 25 to 24.9. And suddenly, magically, they have all the protection they need. That, again, any research class I have ever taken from the undergraduate to doctoral level, I would have, I feel like, not just failed, but they would have been like, there are a lot of majors here and you should probably pick something else because you don't understand this at a fundamental level. And yet this is what passes for strong, solid science. And part of that is because Novo Nordisk has spent 10 years working to try to convince us of this. And so, Louise, do you want to tell us about how they did it?
Well, yeah. So thank you for we briefly forayed into a bit of a rant,
Ruined
but
you.
we're back. So the 2015 shareholder report became a 3-part plan that was essentially Novo Nordisk establishing the obesity as a disease thing, expanding this idea and training health professionals, and then just basically exploiting healthcare systems. That's our take on it. So what happened after that shareholder meeting, because we've got to kind of contextualize what was going on back there. Novo Nordisk had produced the first GLP-1 drug for type 2 diabetes back in the mid-2000s. That was called Victoza. And then essentially what they did was doubled the dose of Victoza and created Saxenda, which is their very first drug that was marketed exclusively for weight loss. Hence, they're taking a bet on obesity thing. So in 2016, a year after this shareholder report, in Australia, in Melbourne actually, at an obesity conference, the Australasian manager of Novo Nordisk gave everyone a PowerPoint presentation where he literally ran them through their 3-pointed marketing plan for the next 10 years. It's quite an extraordinary PowerPoint, and we'll link to it in the show notes. I think it has been taken off the internet now, but I managed to kind of squirrel it away. It's there for posterity. So the first point in their plan was to create legitimacy and urgency for medical management of obesity, which meant generating and disseminating evidence on the science of obesity and its consequences, further recognition of obesity as a chronic disease and the need for long-term medical management, and reduce the stigma associated with obesity. So that was their first step, and this really establishes the market, right?
Yeah. So this is the established step. And something that Louise said to me as we were prepping was the idea that you don't have to create legitimacy and urgency for Ebola. Right? You don't have to create. I said this in episode 1 too, because I think it's such an important point. When you're saying we've got to establish legitimacy and we've got to establish urgency for this quote unquote condition that we've got a drug that we're trying to make into a blockbuster, that has got to be looked at with tremendous scrutiny. And that's before you remember that Novo Nordisk hiked the price of insulin so high that people died because they couldn't get it. So yeah, the reason they need all this creation of the construct and then legitimacy and then urgency and then recognition is because they're making it up without the benefit of whole science. And so that is the piece of it. And I want to point out too here that when they say they want to reduce weight stigma, what they're really doing is co-opting decades of anti-weight stigma work from actual anti-weight stigma activists.
Absolutely. But you see, there's sorry, so much to say. It says reduce stigma associated with obesity. And as fat activists and people who've worked in weight stigma for decades, their use of the term stigma means something very, very different. What they're saying is like the Purdue Pharma version, right? So
Yes.
reduce stigma associated with obesity treatment is really what they want.
Yes.
That's what they want. And they're not saying let's eradicate the stigma against larger bodied people that the weight loss industry has created across decades. They're like, let's reduce like the abject hatred that we've displayed towards larger bodied people, and let's try and make everyone feel sorry for people with this terrible disease. It co-ops the language of weight stigma. It makes everyone feel really good, like they're making such terrific progress in not being assholes, but they're still being assholes if you're pathologizing people.
Yeah, and like that's the big piece of it. They're saying, after years of justifying this repeat business model, right? People lose weight short term, their bodies react to that, they regain the weight, and then they blame fat people. And they were like, oh, okay, it's not your fault. And they're like, see, that reduces stigma because we used to tell you it's your fault, and now we're telling you it's not your fault. We still think you're in a pandemic, epidemic crisis. We still think we should eradicate you. We still want a world without any people like you in it. But like, it's not your fault. Therefore,
Mm.
look, we reduce stigma, ignoring the fact that we could eliminate stigma if we stopped stigmatizing higher weight bodies, if we created a world where people of all sizes could thrive. But what they want to do is create the ideal world for their drug, right? So
Yes.
they're like, if you stop treating fat people like crap, they'll come back to healthcare and then they'll take our drug. And this is the reducing stigma that they're interested in.
Yes, absolutely. It's a scam, basically. So, yeah, the idea that you have to create legitimacy for a disease is just, I mean, it just like you could just stop there. We don't need to create legitimacy for things that really exist, let alone urgency. Creating urgency is abominable, really, because when we're urgent about something, we make risky decisions. We overlook various things. And, when we were in the COVID pandemic, there was urgency. People were literally dying of COVID, and there was maybe risks that the healthcare professions and the regulatory bodies needed to take in order to save lives. But creating urgency around this topic of larger bodied people, which, plenty of people have no urgent health issues. Some do, but it's not kind of all caused and nor will it all be fixed by Saxenda. It's absolutely wild. But they're actually telling people that we're going to create this. We're going to further the recognition of obesity as a chronic disease. So they're just going to start telling people this and the need for long-term medical management, and then using or misusing stigma as a way of smoothing the way. This is kind of wild. Just a note too on stigma. One of the really lovelier things to happen out of this bin fire of the co-option of stigma has been the generation by genuine weight stigma researchers of a brand new definition of weight stigma that perfectly encapsulates what weight stigma is and what we need to be working on to change. So this just happened, didn't it, at the weight stigma conference that has just happened in Oslo. So I thought I'd read it out, if that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Yeah. So this was the culmination of a year's worth of work from everybody who attended the weight stigma conference in Queensland last year, and they presented it this year. So it's gone out across the world to all different kinds of people with lived experience of being larger on the planet, lots of researchers, lots of activists, so really genuine people in this field. There was zero input from pharma or the weight loss industry. So weight stigma is the devaluation and dehumanization of larger bodied people driven by pathologization of higher weight, societal prejudice and discriminatory practices operating at individual, group, community, population and structural levels, limiting full and fair participation in life. So that's the definition of weight stigma. And what is smack bang in the center of that is the pathologizing of larger bodied people. Viewing larger bodied people as diseases with requirements for long-term chronic management is the embodiment of weight stigma.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be really clear. And again, there's no shame in having an actual disease of any kind. The problem here is that simply existing in a higher weight body doesn't qualify. And when you suggest that a group of people should be eradicated because the world would be better or cheaper without them, you are quite obviously going down a bad road. And we've been going down that bad road for quite a long time. And there's no amount of going down that bad road that's going to get us anywhere good. We have to turn around.
Yeah, let's change lanes entirely. So down in Melbourne, 2016, the second prong of Novo Nordisk's marketing plan is to grow and evolve the medical management of obesity, establishing it as a specialty in medicine, support the implementation of guidelines and quality measures, increase evaluation, diagnosis and management of obesity by healthcare professionals.
Yes, this is the step that expands the market. And this is what they're specifically trying to do. And this comes straight out of the 3 playbooks we talked about in episode 1, the weight loss industry, Purdue Pharma's OxyContin playbook, and Novo's own playbook for insulin. They throw money around and they use that money to infiltrate and manipulate healthcare by co-opting processes that would otherwise be guided by credible science, right? The process of creating guidelines, for example. And it can be very subtle. I was giving a talk and someone said, "Are you telling me that the American Diabetes Association and the American Academy of Pediatricians are wrong?" And I was like, "Are you telling me you don't know that those are 2 organizations that are funded by Novo Nordisk? In the case of the American Diabetes Association, heavily funded." And so again, I don't think everybody who's doing this is just out there making bad science for money. I think there are some people out there doing that for real, but there are other people, I think, who are being convinced, and it's because they are so incredible at the mechanism of convincing, and they had a lot of practice with that with insulin, and so they're bringing, again, that playbook right to bear here, and we're just seeing guidelines after guidelines and medical education, and including medical students, right, and continuing medical education and grand rounds that are repeating weight loss industry talking points in an effort to continue to expand the market for these companies' drugs.
Absolutely. And look, I think a really easy way of cutting through what we're trying to say in terms of why we shouldn't let the weight loss industry educate medical professionals or influence clinical guidelines. I just want us to imagine that Jenny Craig shows up, right? And she's going to write national guidelines for the care of people with diabetes. We would literally see what's happening and say, "Can you please leave? We don't care how many Jenny Craig meals you might make out of being involved in this. You're not welcome here." But the pharmaceutical industry brings this kind of shiny veneer of medical dignity, which is very, very deceptive. But the warning bells just don't seem to go off in medical circles when drug companies come with their smart suits and their clinical trials and their stacks and stacks of money. But it's a really simple idea. People who are selling weight loss drugs shouldn't be allowed to be involved in making clinical guidelines recommending the use of weight loss drugs in order to treat larger body people. As an example, in Canada in 2020, Obesity Canada, which is very, very funded by Novo Nordisk and very heavily invested in this whole 3-pronged approach, developed a set of clinical guidelines for the treatment of obesity, and they spent gazillions of months. There's about 720 authors. All of the executive committee members who ran the clinical guidelines were in the pocket of Big Pharma, and particularly Novo Nordisk were the main offenders. They were heavily biased in the idea of medical management of larger bodied people and recommended a lot of Novo's drugs. After they came out, to great acclaim, like no one really knows that Obesity Canada is not actually any kind of legitimate organization. It's literally what we call an AstroTurf shopfront for pharmaceutical money. So they come out with these guidelines and they're doing like announcements and launches for them. And then after that, Novo Nordisk funded a program where other countries in the world could get tailored guidelines to then roll out in their countries. So places like Ireland and in South America. So it's a franchise model of clinical guidelines, which are basically pushing this idea, that really homogenous idea that everyone should start looking at it in this way. So this is happening. That's just one example of an enormous push to influence medical knowledge and medical decisions. And I just really get mad that the kind of capture.
Yeah, and the just stolen credibility and stolen valor of this. And I have to say, it's neither here nor there. But Obesity Canada used to be called the Canadian Obesity Network, which means that their acronym was CON. This was one of my favorite things to talk about, and I was heartbroken when they changed their name. And I don't know if the fact that I absolutely dunked on them for years about this had anything to do. I like to think it did. Probably not. But I was heartbroken when they changed their name, and I feel like they lost a lot of honesty when they went
Mm,
from Con to OC. But
okay.
yeah, it's the brazenness of it and the
Mm,
fact that this idea that the weight loss industry created and put into our minds for decades, being fat is bad, weight loss is the treatment or cure for that. That is not an evidence-based statement. But again, it's reached that like everybody knows where if you say
mm,
that, people look at you like you have three heads. They can't show you any research. And when you question the research that there is, they aren't interested in that conversation typically. But it really has been an incredible con and that has turned into this massive grift based on this core con that's been happening for decades with the
mm.
weight loss industry.
Can't agree more, but you know what? Once a con, always a con. We're not going to stop saying it just because it's baked in. Okay, so the third prong is to elevate access to care for the management of obesity, drive value acceptance for the management and treatment of obesity policy and legislation development, demystify reimbursement and payment for obesity management. Wow, there's a lot
Yeah.
there.
Wow, indeed. So, this is the step that then exploits the market. So, in step two, they manipulated scientific concepts. In this step, they start to manipulate social justice, including, again, the very real and very important concepts around anti weight stigma and also anti racism. And so, here we start to see messaging that the real weight stigma is that people don't have enough access to their drugs. We know because Black and brown scholars have taught us that the idea of pathologizing higher weight bodies in general, weight stigma in general, the body mass index in specific, these things are rooted in and inextricable from racism and anti-Blackness. And highly encourage everyone to check out Sabrina String's Fearing the Black Body, Deshaun Harrison's Belly of the Beast to understand how not only are these things rooted in racism and anti-Blackness, but they continue to disproportionately impact those communities today. Here, the manipulation is to say, oh, the real racism isn't that weight stigma is rooted in racism and anti-Blackness. It's that Black and brown people don't have enough access to our drugs. And they say this while systematically underrepresenting Black and brown communities in their clinical trials. And this to me is just unforgivable and is part of a shameful history of performing experimental medicine on Black and brown populations. And so this is where we get also the idea that you should lobby, everyone should lobby for Medicare coverage of our drugs because that's the way to be anti-racist and that's the way to be anti-weight stigma. And the reality is lobbying for Medicare coverage, first of all, creates more coverage predominantly for seniors. And the reason they need to lobby for Medicare coverage is because after the fen-phen tragedy that Louise talked about in episode 1, Medicare in the United States stopped covering weight loss drugs. And so this is the holy grail for these weight loss drug companies is to get Medicare coverage because that then pressures all of the private insurance in the US's absolutely ridiculous clown shoes healthcare system. So when we lobby for Medicare coverage, we're lobbying predominantly for seniors and some disabled people to get coverage for these drugs. Now, there's a mountain of evidence that shows that weight loss in seniors creates earlier mortality, increases bone breaks and fragility, but we're ignoring all of that and we're suggesting we need to get these drugs to the seniors on this program just as fast as we can. And in reality, even if someone believes that there needs to be more access to these drugs, they could lobby the drug companies themselves. These drugs are being sold at a massive markup. And these drug companies, both Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk, have their own pharmacies, which is an absolute mess and dumpster fire that we do not have full time for today, but we will get to it.
Mm,
Right? But they have their own pharmacies. They could make these drugs accessible to anybody they want, anytime they want. Lobbying for Medicare coverage is about lobbying for their political and financial interests.
mm. I couldn't say it better. That's incredible. And we have a really different health system here in Australia, but their 3-point plan is still being pushed here. So there's been a multitude of obesity experts with cozy relationships with Novo, trumpeting all over the media, going on television programs, going on radio interviews, just spouting about how it's really unfair and it's a matter of equity that people in Australia aren't able to access PBS subsidized weight loss drugs. So that essentially that means Novo Nordisk get direct payments from our government. So the government is paying for Australia's equivalent to like a Jenny Craig membership. And they're calling that an equity and justice problem. And they're co-opting all of the medical research talks about this in this very narrow defined way. So yeah, they're using not only quote unquote patients, but also paid off health professionals and increasingly organizations to put this pressure across health systems across the globe. And when you think about it, we are so far from health equity on the planet. There are so many things that we need to be paying attention to in terms of access before we think about helping everyone to lose 5 to 10% of their weight. It's outrageous. Well, I'm all fired up now.
So to reiterate, first, Novo Nordisk's CEO promised the shareholders that they were going to create the market for obesity. Step one was creating legitimacy and urgency for medical management by promoting this narrative that obesity is a disease requiring long-term medical management and to facilitate the publication of research that furthers that narrative. Step two was to evolve the pharmaceuticalization of obesity by influencing professional guidelines and targeting health professionals through education campaigns with big air quotes. And step three was to exploit ideas around social justice to promote government and insurance funding for medications for obesity. And then step four is the massive profits they promised to their shareholders.
My goodness. Well, again, this is a lot, but we hope that you're getting a sense of just how important it is to dig beyond the headlines and figure out on a really meaningful level just what on earth has been going on for the last decade in particular and what we can do about it. So tune in next time. We are going to continue this and we're going to dig deep into the first part of this, Novo's triumph of marketing over science. So thanks for joining us. And look, if today has got you thinking, again, we just really want to hear from you. Have you got any insider information about the weight loss industry? Maybe you worked for a pharma company or a weight loss organization or clinic, a patient advocacy group. Have you seen something or experienced something that you think we should know about? If so, you can visit our Obesity Leaks portal at speakpipe.com/obesileaks. That's with an I. And leave us a voice message. You can do this anonymously. It's completely free. We'll listen to all of the messages and we want to hear, the all the goss. If you're looking for show notes, resources, all of the lovely books that we've talked about today, or even a quick link into Obesity Leaks and a lot more, you can check us out at exposingobesityincorporated.com. Once again, a huge thank you for listening and we'll see you next time.
Yes, and if you have any questions you would like to ask, if you have topics you want us to cover, we really want to hear from you. So reach out at obesityincorporated@gmail.com.
Take care.
Bye.